The 1885 Mudflood ruins of Philadelphia, the city they tried to hide. I wasn't looking for ruins when I started investigating Philadelphia's architectural record. I was researching the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, trying to understand how a city barely a century old could construct such elaborate, permanent buildings with such impossible speed. Standard historical curiosity. But then I found the photographs, not the official exhibition photos, not the carefully staged promotional images designed to showcase American progress. I found the construction photographs, the before pictures, the images showing what was there before they built the exhibition grounds. And what I saw didn't make sense. The land wasn't empty. It wasn't undeveloped prairie or simple farmland requiring clearing. The photographs showed ruins, extensive ruins, stone foundations of enormous buildings, partially buried structures, architectural remnants of a scale and sophistication that had no place in the official timeline of Philadelphia's development. Ruins that were photographed once, documented briefly, and then systematically destroyed to make way for the Centennial Exhibition. Ruins that were erased so thoroughly that most people today have no idea they ever existed. The official story of Philadelphia is clean and simple. Founded by William Penn in 1682, developed gradually throughout the 1700s, it became a major city by the early 1800s. By 1876, mature enough to host America's first World's Fair, celebrating a century of independence with elaborate temporary buildings that were later demolished. But here is what the official story cannot explain. Where did the ruins come from? What buildings were those stone foundations supporting? Who built structures of such permanence that their remnants were still visible in 1875, requiring deliberate demolition rather than simple clearing? Photographs exist in the Library of Congress archives. Most are labeled Fairmount Park Improvement Project from 1874 to 1875. Improvement, that is the word they used, as if they were enhancing empty land rather than destroying evidence of previous occupation. One image shows workers with pickaxes and sledgehammers breaking apart a stone wall. The wall is at least 12 feet high in the photograph, and that is after obvious burial. You can see where the ground level has risen, where earth covers what were clearly lower sections of the structure. The stones are massive, individual blocks weighing multiple tons, fitted together with the precision we associate with ancient megalithic construction, not American colonial building practices. Another photograph shows a partially excavated plaza or courtyard. The paving stones are intact, arranged in complex, geometric patterns. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. In the background, you can see the remnants of columns, enormous cylindrical stone columns that appear to have supported a structure of monumental scale. These images were taken in 1874 and 1875. Just before the Centennial Exhibition construction began. Just before all of this was demolished, buried, and paved over to create the exhibition grounds that would showcase American achievement. The timing is too convenient, too precise. And it raises a simple but critical question. What were they hiding? I started mapping the Fairmount Park ruins against other documented mudflood evidence in Philadelphia. The pattern emerged immediately. The ruins were not isolated. They were part of a larger, buried landscape. A landscape that extended throughout what is now central Philadelphia, showing consistent evidence of catastrophic burial occurring sometime in the mid-19th century. City Hall, Philadelphia's massive municipal building, sits on top of extensive underground chambers that officially do not exist. Construction workers building City Hall's foundations in the 1870s and the 1880s kept encountering pre-existing stone structures. The reports describe vaults of unknown origin, chambers built with ancient masonry techniques, and passageways extending in multiple directions beneath the construction site. The City Hall foundation work began in 1871 and was not completed until 1901. 30 years to build a foundation. The official explanation points to engineering challenges, political delays, and funding issues. But the construction foreman wrote in his private journals, which I found in a descendant's possession, and they tell a different story. He wrote the following in his journal: "We are not building so much as navigating. The ground beneath is not earth, but architecture. We break through stone floors into chambers below. We encounter walls that must be demolished before we can proceed. We are building atop a city that already exists, buried and forgotten." A city that already exists, buried and forgotten. In 1871, Philadelphia was a city officially founded less than 200 years earlier. What could possibly be buried and forgotten in a location that young? Unless the burial was recent. Unless something catastrophic happened in the mid-19th century that covered an existing city, forced survivors to build on top of the wreckage, and required rapid reconstruction with minimal investigation of what lay beneath. The evidence points to 1885 as a critical year. That is when the documentation changes. Before 1885, Philadelphia newspapers occasionally mention discoveries of old foundations or mysterious underground structures. After 1885, these reports stop, not gradually, abruptly. And 1885 is when something else happens. Philadelphia's street levels suddenly rise. City planning documents from the 1880s show systematic street raising throughout central Philadelphia. Entire blocks had earth added, raising the grade by 6, 8, sometimes 10 feet. The official explanation cites flood control and drainage improvement. But flood control does not require raising entire neighborhoods uniformly. Flood control does not explain why the street raising occurs simultaneously across districts with different elevations and different drainage patterns. And flood control certainly does not explain why the raised streets precisely match the level of burial we see in buildings showing obvious mudflood evidence. Independence Hall, America's birthplace, the building where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The official timeline says it was built in 1753. Look at the structure today. The ground floor windows are at street level, yes. But examine the basement. The basement windows are half buried. They open onto window wells that descend several feet below the current street grade. Those were not designed as basement windows. The proportions are wrong. The decorative elements are too elaborate. Those were ground floor windows, designed to be at street level, designed for natural light and aesthetic presence. They are buried now because the street level rose, because earth was added after the building was constructed, because something covered the original ground level and forced adaptation. The official explanation says the basement was always a basement, that the window wells were intentional design features. But that explanation requires ignoring the architectural evidence. It requires pretending that colonial builders created elaborate decorative windows for spaces they intended to be below grade. It requires accepting that window wells requiring constant maintenance were preferred over simple ground-level openings. The evidence points to burial, recent burial that occurred long after Independence Hall was constructed, burial that forced the ground floor to become an elevated entry and the original street level to become a buried basement. I found construction photographs from Philadelphia's subway excavation in the early 1900s. The images show workers breaking through layers of earth and rubble. Beneath the rubble, they consistently encountered stone, not bedrock, worked stone, paving stones, building foundations, structural elements that predated the city above. One photograph from 1908 shows an exposed section described in the caption as Old Sewer Tunnel. The tunnel is 12 feet in diameter. The stonework is precision fitted. The construction quality exceeds anything in the modern subway being built around it. That is not a sewer, that is not colonial infrastructure, that is something else. The workers in the photograph look confused. They stand next to steam-powered excavation machinery, next to stonework that their tools can barely damage. The contrast is stark. The buried infrastructure is superior to what is being built to replace it. And that pattern repeats throughout Philadelphia's underground. Every major excavation project from the 1870s onward encounters pre-existing structures that do not match the official timeline. Structures showing construction techniques supposedly unavailable in colonial America, structures that suggest a building tradition more sophisticated than what the historical record acknowledges. The deeper I went into Philadelphia's architectural history, the more I noticed scale anomalies. Buildings from the early 1800s with doorways that seem excessively tall, not ceremonial entrances, ordinary doors, residential doorways measuring 10, 12, sometimes 14 feet high. The official explanation calls it federal-style grandeur, but grandeur does not require making every door in a house proportionally excessive, unless the doors were not excessive, unless they were appropriately scaled for the intended occupants, unless Philadelphia, like cities worldwide, was built for beings larger than the current human population. I examined property records from the 1850s through the 1880s. There is a pattern that does not make sense in conventional terms. Properties throughout central Philadelphia change hands repeatedly during this period, not through normal sales or inheritance, through abandonment and reclamation. Properties listed as abandoned, origin of previous occupant unknown, and then reassigned to new residents. Hundreds of properties, possibly thousands, all abandoned within the same narrow time frame, all showing the same mysterious absence of documentation about who the previous occupants were or why they left. That is not normal property transfer. That is systematic replacement. That is evidence of a population disappearing and a new population being installed. And it happens precisely when the mudflood evidence suggests catastrophic disruption, precisely when the street levels rise, precisely when the ruins in Fairmount Park get demolished. The Centennial Exhibition of 1876 takes on new significance in this context. Why was Philadelphia chosen to host America's first World's Fair? The official answer emphasizes historical importance and Philadelphia's role in founding the nation. But there is another possibility. What if the exhibition was a cover? What if the massive construction project, the elaborate temporary buildings, the extensive ground preparation, all of it provided justification for destroying evidence that could not be explained? What if the ruins in Fairmount Park, the buried architecture throughout the city, the scale mismatches and timeline anomalies, all of it required an explanation that the authorities could not provide, so they created a different narrative. They hosted a celebration of American progress. They built elaborate exhibition halls that would be photographed and documented. And in the process of preparing the grounds, they demolished the ruins, buried the evidence, and filled the city with visitors who would remember Philadelphia for its exhibition rather than for its mysterious buried past. The exhibition buildings themselves are fascinating. Supposedly temporary structures, yet they were built with permanent foundations, with stone and iron construction that exceeded what many permanent buildings received. Why build temporary exhibition halls with such permanence? Unless they were not entirely new construction, unless some of those exhibition buildings incorporated existing foundations and structural elements from the ruins they had discovered, unless the temporary buildings were actually adaptive reuse, a way to preserve some elements while destroying others, a way to control the narrative about what existed before. Several of the major exhibition buildings remained standing for decades after the fair ended. Some were eventually converted to permanent use, some were deliberately demolished, but all of them sat on ground that photographs from 1874 showed contained extensive ruins. The transition was managed carefully, the ruins were photographed minimally, the demolition was conducted rapidly, The exhibition construction proceeded with unusual speed, and by the time visitors arrived in 1876, the landscape had been completely transformed. The ruins were gone, the buried past was paved over, and Philadelphia could present itself as a triumph of American development rather than as inheritor of something it did not build. I found a letter in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania archives, written in 1875 by a construction foreman to a city official. The foreman describes discovering an extensive complex of stone buildings while clearing land for the exhibition. He asks for guidance on how to proceed and whether the structures should be preserved for study. The city official's response is brief. He wrote that they should demolish completely, maintain no detailed records, and proceed with exhibition preparation as scheduled. No preservation, no study, no records, just destroy the evidence and continue as planned. That is not normal archaeological practice, even for the 1870s. That is deliberate suppression. That is a decision made at high levels to ensure that what they had found would not complicate the official narrative. And it worked. The Centennial Exhibition was celebrated as a triumph. Millions visited. Philadelphia was commemorated as a symbol of American achievement. And the ruins beneath, the evidence of previous occupation, the architectural sophistication that predated the official timeline, all of it was forgotten. But the evidence persists. The buried basements remain. The oversized doorways still stand. The underground structures discovered during every major excavation project continue to appear. The photographic record, minimal though it is, survives in archives. And the timeline anomalies, the property abandonment patterns, the rapid street razing, all of it points to the same conclusion. Something happened in Philadelphia in the 1880s, something that buried the existing city. Something that required rapid replacement of the population, something that needed to be hidden so thoroughly that hosting a World's Fair became preferable to admitting what they had found beneath the ground. The Mudflood was not just burial, it was opportunity. Opportunity to rewrite history, to claim buildings they did not construct, to inherit infrastructure they did not understand, to populate a ready-made city and pretend it had developed naturally over centuries, when in fact it was captured, occupied and repurposed within a single generation. I keep thinking about those workers in 1874, demolishing ruins that were clearly superior to anything they could build, smashing stones they could not lift, destroying architecture they could not replicate, following orders to erase evidence of something that contradicted everything they had been taught about American history. Did they understand what they were destroying? Did they question why such elaborate structures needed to be demolished rather than studied? Did they wonder who built what they were breaking apart? Or had they been taught not to ask? Had the suppression already become so normalized that destroying evidence was simply part of the job, no different from clearing trees or moving earth? The descendants of those workers sometimes remember. Family stories passed down, whispered accounts of a grandfather or great-grandfather who worked on the Centennial grounds and saw things that did not make sense. Buildings that seemed ancient, foundations that seemed impossibly precise, chambers beneath the ground that suggested purposes they could not understand. These stories do not appear in official histories. They do not get included in museum exhibitions about Philadelphia's development. They are family knowledge, private memory, the kind of evidence that is easy to dismiss as exaggeration or confusion. But when you collect enough of these stories, when you map them against the photographic evidence, the construction records, the timeline anomalies, the pattern becomes undeniable. Philadelphia was not built by the people we have been taught, built it. It was inherited, occupied, claimed by people who found it partially destroyed and chose to rebuild on top rather than investigate what they had found. The date 1885 keeps appearing in property records, in construction documents, and in the shift from newspaper reports that mention mysterious underground discoveries to a complete silence on the topic. Something happened that year, something that completed the transition, something that finalized the cover-up. I have not found direct evidence of what occurred in 1885, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Before that year, Philadelphia still showed signs of its previous incarnation. After that year, the modern city was firmly established, the narrative was set, the questions stopped being asked. And now, over a century later, we are left with fragments. Buried basements that were ground floors, oversized doorways that made sense for different occupants, underground structures that appear during excavation and get sealed again without study. Photographs of ruins demolished to make way for an exhibition celebrating a history that was not entirely true. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you understand what happened in Philadelphia, you have to ask what happened everywhere else. How many American cities were built on buried ruins? How many founding stories are actually occupation stories? How many times was this pattern repeated across the continent? The ruins are still there. Beneath the streets, beneath the modern construction, beneath the official narrative, waiting for someone willing to look, willing to question, willing to connect the evidence that has been scattered and suppressed for over a century. What do you think? Have you noticed Philadelphia's architectural anomalies? Do you know of similar discoveries in other cities? Share your thoughts, but be aware the algorithm does not want this discussed. The city they tried to hide is still there, buried but not destroyed, forgotten but not erased. And every excavation, every construction project, every time someone digs deep enough, the evidence resurfaces. The question is not whether it exists. The question is why we are still pretending it does not.